His daughter hadn't spoken since her mother died. The schoolteacher heard her voice first. The girl sat in the back row of the Elm Fork schoolhouse every morning at 8 o'clock, her slate on the desk and her hands folded and her mouth closed. She was 7 years old, small for her age, with dark hair that her father braided each morning in a way that was earnest but imprecise, one side always tighter than the other, the ribbon slipping by noon. Her name was Pearl Oakes, and she had not spoken a word in 4 months. June Prescott noticed her on the first day of the term. June had come to Elm Fork from Lawrence, where she had taught for 3 years at a school with 40 students, and a principal who believed that children learned best through fear. She had left because she believed otherwise, and because a posting in a small Kansas town paid the same, and came with a cottage behind the church, and the freedom to teach as she saw fit. She was 25, plain-spoken, with brown hair she pinned up in a knot that never quite held, and she had the particular patience of a woman who had learned early that the most important things take time. She asked the other children about Pearl on the second day, quietly, during recess. Tommy Briggs, who was 9 and knew everything about everyone, said that Pearl's mother had died of the fever in April, and that Pearl had stopped talking the day of the funeral and had not started again. Her father, Colton Oakes, ran a cattle ranch east of town. He had brought Pearl to school on the first day and spoken briefly with June at the door. "She does not talk," he had said, standing with his hat in his hands, a tall man with weathered skin and eyes that looked like they had been tired for a long time. "The doctor says there is nothing wrong with her throat. She just stopped." "I understand," June had said. "I do not think you do," Colton said, not unkindly, "but I appreciate you saying it." June did not push Pearl. She did not call on her in class or ask her to read aloud or put her in situations where her silence would be conspicuous. She seated Pearl near the window where the morning light was good and gave her books that were slightly above her level, because June suspected that Pearl was sharper than her age suggested. Pearl read them all. She did her sums perfectly. She wrote on her slate in a small, precise hand that was better than most of the older children's. She did everything that was asked of her, except speak. The other children were kind about it, mostly. Children in small towns are practical about differences. They accommodate what they cannot change and move on. But June noticed that Pearl sat alone during the noon meal, eating the biscuit and dried apple that her father packed each morning, watching the other children play with an expression that was not loneliness exactly, but something more complicated, the face of someone who wanted to join, but had forgotten how to begin. June began eating her own lunch near Pearl, not beside her, but close enough that they shared the same patch of shade under the cottonwood tree. She did not speak to Pearl during these meals. She simply sat and ate, and sometimes read aloud from a book, not directing the reading at Pearl, but letting it exist in the air between them, the way music exists, available but not demanding. She read from Grimm's fairy tales and from a book of animal stories, and once from a guide to wildflowers of the Kansas prairie that she had found in the schoolhouse drawer. Pearl listened. June could tell because the girl's eyes tracked the pages and her body stilled the way a person's body stills when they are giving something their full attention. Colton Oakes came to the school every Friday to collect Pearl. He tied his horse to the fence post and stood by the gate, and Pearl walked to him and took his hand, and they left without ceremony. June watched this exchange each week and saw in it the shape of a grief that had reorganized a family. Colton held his daughter's hand the way a man holds something he is afraid of dropping. Pearl walked beside him with the quiet obedience of a child who has learned that the people she loves can disappear. On the 4th Friday, June walked to the gate as Colton was waiting. "She is doing well," June said. "Her reading is advanced for her age. Her arithmetic is strong." Colton nodded. He looked at the schoolhouse as though he could see his daughter through the walls. "Does she talk?" he asked. "No." He nodded again. The hope that had flickered in his eyes went out, and June felt the weight of it like a physical thing. "Mr. Oakes," she said, "I would like to visit your ranch, if you would allow it. I think it might help Pearl if I understood her life outside the schoolhouse." Colton looked at her. His expression was guarded, the expression of a man who had heard many suggestions about his daughter's condition and had learned that most of them were useless. He had taken Pearl to doctors in 2 towns. He had tried talking to her, reading to her, begging her. He had sat by her bed at night and told her stories about her mother, hoping that the sound of Mariel's name would unlock whatever door Pearl had closed. Nothing worked. The silence had become a wall between them, and Colton did not know which side of it he was on. "You can come Saturday," he said. The ranch was 6 miles east of town, a spread of grassland with a house and a barn, and a corral that held a dozen head of horses. The house was neat, in the way that a house maintained by a man alone is neat. Surfaces wiped, floors swept, everything in its place, but without the warmth that comes from someone who arranges things because they want to, not because they should. There were no curtains in the kitchen, and the windowsill held a tin cup of dried wildflowers that someone had picked months ago and no one had thrown away. A woman's apron hung on a hook by the stove, faded blue calico, and Colton had not moved it. These small relics of Mariel were everywhere. A hairbrush on the shelf, a recipe card tacked to the wall in handwriting that was not Colton's, a pair of garden gloves on the back porch, and Colton moved around them the way a man moves around furniture in a dark room, carefully, from memory, never touching. Pearl's room had a bed with a quilt and a shelf with 3 books and a rag doll that sat in the corner looking like it had not been touched in a long time. June noticed the garden. It was behind the house, fenced with wire, and it was dead. Not neglected, dead the way a garden dies when the person who tended it is gone. The soil was hard, and the stakes were still standing, but the plants had dried to sticks, and no one had pulled them. "That was Mariel's," Colton said, following her gaze. "My wife. She grew tomatoes and beans and those yellow flowers. I do not remember the name. Marigolds. Pearl helped her every afternoon." June looked at the dead garden and the little girl standing in the yard and understood something she had not understood before. Pearl's silence was not stubbornness or damage. It was a door she had closed because the person she most wanted to talk to was gone, and opening it again felt like admitting that her mother was not coming back. June began coming to the ranch on Saturdays. She told Colton it was for Pearl's education, which was true in a way that was larger than schoolwork. She brought books and read to Pearl on the porch while Colton worked the horses in the corral. She brought pencils and paper and they drew together. June drew badly and Pearl drew well, and the contrast made something almost like amusement cross Pearl's face, which was progress. On one visit, Colton's horse threw a shoe while he was working the corral, and June held the animal's head and talked to it while Colton pried off the old shoe and nailed on a new one. She was not afraid of horses, which surprised him. She told him she had grown up on a farm in Missouri before the war, and that her father had kept draft horses, and that she had learned to be steady around large animals because they could feel your fear in your hands. "You have good hands," Colton said, and then looked away as though he had said more than he intended. Pearl, sitting on the fence rail, watched this exchange with eyes that missed nothing. She looked from her father to the schoolteacher and back again, and something in her expression softened. Not a smile, but the ghost of one, the shadow a smile leaves when it is almost ready to arrive. On the 3rd Saturday, June brought seeds. She did not explain them. She simply knelt in the dead garden and began pulling the old stalks and turning the hard soil with a spade she found in the barn. Pearl watched from the porch for 20 minutes, then came down the steps and knelt beside her. They worked in silence, side by side, clearing the beds and breaking the clods and making the soil ready. Colton came around the corner of the barn and stopped. He stood there for a long time, watching the schoolteacher and his daughter work in his dead wife's garden, and something moved across his face that he turned away to hide. They planted the seeds the following Saturday, beans and tomatoes and marigolds, because June had asked Colton what Mariel had grown, and Colton had told her in a voice that cracked once and then steadied. Pearl placed each seed in the furrow with the careful precision of a child who understands that small things matter. June covered them and watered them, and Pearl patted the soil flat with both hands. The garden grew. The beans came up first, pale green shoots that pushed through the dark soil like small fists opening. Pearl checked them every day after school, kneeling beside the rows and touching the leaves with her fingertips. Colton told June this on a Friday at the gate, and his voice was different, lighter, as though something heavy had shifted in his chest. He stood at the gate the way he always stood, hat in his hands, but his shoulders were lower, and his jaw was unclenched, and he looked at June with an expression that she could not quite read, but that made her pulse do something she would have to think about later. June smiled, and Colton's face did something unexpected. It opened. The guarded, tired expression that he wore like armor shifted, and underneath it was a face that was younger than she had realized, and kinder, and more vulnerable than any face she had seen on a grown man. "She sits out there until dark," he said. "She watches them like they are going to run away." "They are not going to run away," June said. "I know. I think she knows too. But she watches anyway." The marigolds bloomed in July, bright yellow against the dark soil, and Pearl stood in the garden looking at them with an expression that June had never seen on her face before. Open, unguarded, as though the flowers had reached a part of her that words could not. June was kneeling beside the tomato plants on a Saturday afternoon, staking them against the wind, when she heard it. A small voice, rough from disuse, quiet as a held breath. "Miss Prescott." June's hands went still on the stake. She did not turn around. She did not move. She knelt in the dirt with the sun on her back and let the moment be what it was. "Yes, Pearl," she said. "The marigolds look like the ones Mama grew. They are the same kind." A pause. Then, "I miss her." "I know you do, sweetheart." Another pause. Longer this time. June could hear the wind in the grass and the horses in the corral, and her own heart beating in her ears. "Can we plant more?" Pearl asked. "We can plant as many as you want." June turned then, slowly, and looked at the girl standing among the marigolds with dirt on her knees, and tears on her face, and her mouth open for the first time in 4 months. Pearl was not smiling. She was crying, but she was speaking, and the words came out of her like water through a crack in a dam, slowly at first, then steadily, then in a flood that carried everything she had been holding. She talked about her mother. She talked about the garden and the fever and the day her mother did not wake up and the silence that had followed, which had felt like the only safe place in a world that had taken the one voice she most wanted to hear. She talked until she was empty, and June held her in the dirt between the marigolds and the beans and let her talk. Colton found them there. He came around the barn and saw his daughter speaking, and his knees buckled, and he caught himself on the fence post and stood there with his hand over his mouth and his eyes closed. "Papa," Pearl said. It was the first word she had said to him in 4 months. Colton crossed the yard in 3 strides and gathered his daughter into his arms and held her, and June stood up and stepped back and let them have the moment that had been waiting all this time. That evening, after Pearl had gone to bed, talking all the way through supper and bath and bedtime story, as though making up for lost time, Colton sat on the porch with June and said nothing for a long while. "How did you know?" he asked finally. "The garden, the seeds. How did you know that would work?" "I did not know," June said. "I just thought that if she could grow something her mother had grown, she might feel less like her mother was gone." Colton looked at her. The tiredness in his eyes had not disappeared, but it had changed. It was the tiredness of a man who has been carrying something heavy and has just been shown where to set it down. "Stay for supper tomorrow," he said. "I stayed for supper today." "Stay for supper tomorrow too." She stayed for supper tomorrow, and the day after that, and the days after that, stopped being something either of them counted. June came to the ranch after school and read with Pearl and worked in the garden and cooked supper while Colton worked the horses, and the house that had been neat and empty began to feel like something more, a place with warmth in it, a place that smelled like marigolds and biscuits, and the particular kind of hope that grows in soil that has been tended. One evening in August, a thunderstorm rolled across the prairie, and the power of it shook the house. Pearl ran from her room and climbed into June's lap on the porch rocker, and June held her while the lightning cracked and the rain came down in sheets. Colton stood in the doorway and watched them, his daughter in the arms of the woman who had given her back her voice, and the look on his face was not complicated. It was the simplest thing he had felt in months. It was love, and it was gratitude, and it was the quiet, terrified hope of a man who has found something he is afraid to lose. After Pearl fell asleep, Colton carried her to bed and came back to the porch. June was still in the rocker, listening to the rain. "She called you Mama today," he said quietly. "When you were in the garden, Thier. She did not know I heard." June's breath caught. She looked at her hands in her lap, and then at the man standing in the doorway, and she did not trust herself to speak. "I wanted you to know," Colton said, "because it matters." "It matters," June said. Colton asked her to marry him in September, in the garden, because that was where everything had begun. Pearl stood between them and held both their hands and said yes, before either of the adults could speak. They were married by the circuit preacher in October, with the whole school in attendance. Pearl served as flower girl and carried a bouquet of marigolds from the garden she had helped plant. And when the preacher asked if anyone objected, Pearl said, "Nobody better," in a clear, strong voice that carried across the churchyard and made everyone laugh and 2 people cry. The schoolteacher who had come to Elm Fork for a quiet posting found a family instead. The rancher who had not known how to reach his silent daughter found a woman who knew that sometimes the way back to speech is through dirt and seeds and patience. And the girl who had closed her mouth against a world that had taken her mother opened it again, one word at a time, in a garden that bloomed every summer after.